Hello and welcome to our first podcast episode. I'm Abdulatif Ashatti and I'll be your host today in this episode featuring an insightful conversation with the renowned Dr. Sarah Mercer. In this episode, we delve into the fascinating world of second language motivation and classroom engagement, where Dr. Mercer shares her expertise and offers valuable insights that will undoubtedly leave you inspired and informed. With her extensive background in learner engagement, Dr. Mercer brings a unique perspective that sheds light on learner engagement, active learning, and learner autonomy. So, you're in for a treat as we dive deep into a thought-provoking discussion with Dr. Mercer. Without further ado, grab your favorite drink, sit back, and prepare to embark on a journey of knowledge and discovery as we explore learner engagement in language classrooms with the brilliant Dr. Sarah Mercer. Welcome again, Dr. Mercer. Could you please give me a brief introduction on your background in linguistics and your research interests related to language learner engagement?
Sure. So I started as a language teacher, and I think the first thing that I was really interested in was actually language learning strategies. So this is, not wishing to age myself dramatically here, but this was a time when strategies were still, quite at their heyday. And I was very interested. So I developed an experiential approach to teaching language learning strategies. And I researched that for my MA. And in that process, I discovered that it wasn't that the students gained a particular knowledge of language or particular linguistic benefits from this strategy training, but actually they became more confident. They had a sense of agency. They had a sense that they could control their learning. They had a plan of attack. And so because of that, I got interested in the psychology of learning language and the psychology of how people respond to what happens in the classroom, the instruction that they get, whether they engage with it or don't engage with it, and so on. Kind of that's how it all began, was with the classroom, looking at strategies, and then I became interested in the psychology. And since then, I researched extensively on the learner, and then I was interested in complex dynamic systems theory. And that is about understanding the relationships between things in the classroom and people in the classroom. And then it started to think, that's, for me, that was kind of interesting, is what about the teacher? What about their psychology? How does that relate to learner psychology? And that then set me on a path for understanding a little bit better also teacher psychology and the interplay with learner psychology.
I've seen some videos about teacher well-being as well.
Yeah, so we did so my team and I in Graz, we've been researching that for about the past 10 years now. So we started researching it before it became fashionable to research it. And I have come to believe that that's an incredibly important part of what happens in the classroom, that understanding the well-being of the teacher and the motivation, the engagement, the frame of mind, the emotions of the teacher is critical to understanding what happens in the classroom and how they teach and how they relate to learners and the kind of relationships that are built.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, so now if we want to define learner engagement in the context of language learning, how can we define it?
Oh, well, that could probably fill the podcast, so I'll try and give a short response. Essentially, the way that Zoltan and I approach this is that the difference between motivation and engagement is motivation can set up how interested you are, how ready you are to learn, and so on. But it doesn't mean you'll actually engage. You can get distracted, you can get, taken away from your focus. So engagement really is about that action. It's really about that being on task, doing something, being actively engaged. And that for us was kind of the key defining criteria. But engagement's got three components. It's got the behavioral element. It's got a cognitive element. So are you actually thinking about what you should be thinking about? Are you engaging deeply? Are you thinking deeply about it? And it's got an emotional component. So are you emotionally engaged? Are you enjoying what you're doing? Are you interested in what you're doing? So it's those three elements together. And sometimes one aspect of it is more heightened than the others. But ideally, you want all three to be happening together for sort of genuine, authentic, deep engagement.
So can we say that motivation is psychological and engagement is social, practical?
That's a good question. I think they're both intertwined. I think this debate about motivation and engagement is quite tricky. I think motivation for me, as I've come to understand it, and I know that there'll be people who disagree with me on this, motivation is kind of the frame of mind that you're in, your willingness to engage, your interest, your wanting to learn, but it doesn't concern with what you actually do. It sets you up in the condition that you might want to learn and take certain actions and engage in certain behaviors, but it's no guarantee. And engagement is where you convert, if you like, that underlying motivation into behaviors in class and actions.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So so to some extent, we can say that it's like the something mental, psychological, whereas, for example, engagement, no, it's practical, something that happens in class, something hands-on.
Yes, I think engagement sort of encompasses all that. So I think if you're looking at, as a teacher, if you're looking at your classroom and thinking about how can you get your learners engaged, Zoltan and I talked about sort of 3 stages. There's stage 1 is getting the learners willing to engage. So that's where exactly what you're talking about is that kind of groundwork of getting them interested, getting them motivated, having that positive group dynamics, helping them feel safe in the classroom. So that's the absolutely essential groundwork so that they would fundamentally be willing to engage. Yeah. And sort of the second stage is then getting their engagement, getting their attention, getting them interested in a particular task, catching their attention, making sure that they start to engage with something. And then the really challenge for teachers is not just to grab their attention, but to keep it and to maintain that engagement. So it's a bit of a simplistic way of looking at it, but it's sort of, I think it's quite useful to think about in practical terms. So stage 1, creating that atmosphere, those psychological preconditions, that social conditions that make learners willing and comfortable to engage. And then using tasks and activities and the way you set things up so that learners get curious, get hooked on what it is you're doing, get interested in the task, and then keep them with you as you move through the task and you work through
this I think is the best way to engage them in classroom activities as well. Yeah. Okay, so are there any indicators or behaviors that demonstrate high level of engagement in the classroom?
So this is a really interesting question. So I need to tell you about some research that we did that has humbled me deeply also as a teacher. So we did some research with our learners here at the University of Graz, and we talked to them, we had them do focus groups, and we talked to them about their engagement and how engaged they were in class. And my learners are wonderfully honest and frank, so they tell you the truth, like really the truth. And what came out of our wonderful focus group discussions with these learners was that, of course, there are many times when learners fake engagement. So they pretend to be engaged. And I bet there isn't a single person listening who isn't sort of smiling to themselves because they know that we've all done it. And sometimes you go to a conference and it's not that you just sometimes you're tired or your mind's on something else. And you do things like you nod and smile at the presenter.
That's interesting.
Or you just, so you pretend that you're engaged, but actually mentally you're somewhere completely different or you're not engaged at all. So we became very sensitive to that notion of fake engagement versus authentic engagement. So fake engagement is basically where you're deliberately, consciously trying to pretend to be engaged, but you're not. And the reasons why learners do that are varied. And it doesn't always have to do with your teaching. It doesn't make you a bad teacher just because your learners are faking it. Sometimes they're just tired. They have other things going on in their lives. They're busy. Sometimes even it's a sign of respect, because we actually did find that some learners said, I don't even bother faking it with him because he doesn't invest in us, so I don't invest in him. So, that's okay. Now, the things that typically reflect when learners are genuinely engaged, of course, the most obvious one is when they ask questions. So questions are a wonderful kind of telltale sign that they have sort of thought about what's happening and thought about their learning to be able to ask questions. And that's why sometimes the activities I set for my learners are they have to come up with questions. They have to be the ones that generate the questions, and they have to come up with questions for their peers, questions for me, and so on. So questions are a very good way of engaging with cognitive engagement, particularly because you can see they've been thinking about it, that they've thought, obviously, the kind of work that they do, if they're on task and they're working and they're producing things, you can see when that's taking place. But I think there is also that fine line that's a tricky line to manage where learners are simply complying. They're just doing what you ask them to do because they have to do it. And that they're actually mentally or emotionally invested in what's happening. Now, probably going to say something a bit controversial. Sometimes maybe that's the best you can hope for with some learners at some points in time. And the teacher, that's okay. Just because at some moment in time they're just going through the motions with you doesn't mean you can't trigger an engagement in that process that might convert that to authentic engagement. So nothing in the classroom is fixed. And sometimes as a teacher, you might say, you know what, they're just going through the motions. Okay, but I've got them partly there. Now let me work on how I can perhaps get them a bit more authentically engaged. So, it's not necessarily a bad thing if they're sometimes just going through the motions, as long as it's not what they're doing every lesson, every day of the week. That would be a bit frustrating.
Yeah, once I felt that with my students, so what I did is that after the midterms, I gave them anonymous mid-course evaluation.
Right.
To give me the pros and cons of the course, what they learned, how if they want something changed in the teaching methodologies, in the evaluation and assessment, and feedback, anything in the class. That was pretty helpful. Like one of the students, I used to use the PowerPoint and projectors and technology. Some comments were about using the Blackboard, actually. They wanted me to use the Blackboard. It's more helpful to them. So
that's the perfect example of one of the best ways to build up your relationship with the learner is to talk to them. Yes. And to give them that channel to communicate with you and to give you feedback. One, because like you say, you learn about your own teaching from their perspective. You come up with ideas of how you can maybe do it differently in ways that are pleasing to them. But also the fact, I think it's lovely that the fact that you even ask for their opinion is quite important in showing them respect, showing them that you are taking them seriously, that you're interested in their perspective. And for learners, that's quite important that they feel they have a voice. So one of the things that Zoltan and I explored was this notion of it's not just us, this phrase has been used in many places, so it hasn't just originated from us, is choice and voice in the classroom. Yeah. And what you just described is a wonderful example of giving them voice, giving them a chance to influence what happens in the classroom and building that relationship by opening dialogue with them. I think it's a lovely example.
Yeah, it helped actually. Yeah, I was shocked because, now students, they want technologies, games in order to be engaged in the tasks. But a couple of students, they wanted me to use like a Blackboard so they can follow me. I was shocked, but it worked with them.
I think it's also something, one of the key things that we established in that book was to think about the notion of variety. That we vary what we do, that if we're always using the same, and I fall into that trap most definitely, but if we're always using the same tools, the same methodologies, it is going to get overly familiar. And like you say, sometimes going back to more traditional way of doing things adds that little bit of spice, a little bit of variety. So this last weekend, I've just been away with my doctoral students, well, a group of doctoral students, not just mine. And we spent the whole weekend doing PowerPoints and doing presentations, and we were in the computer room and the weather was lovely for a change. And so on the last day, I had them write things on little pieces of paper on different coloured cards, and we went outside and we stood up and we did something moving around, and we did an activity that had them completely out of the classroom with little bits of paper and moving around the group and in the fresh air, and it completely and utterly transformed the activity we could have done in class, and we could have done it with the computer. But that going back to sort of more old-fashioned thinking, because of that variety and that mobility was actually quite nice for all of us.
Yeah, sometimes you need that to break the routine as well.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Yeah. Okay, so do you think there are some internal and external factors that affect engagement? When we talk about internal, we talk about motivation, interest, self-regulation, and external, we maybe talk about teaching methods, instructional materials that contribute to learner engagement in the classroom.
Yeah, good question. Loads of things, actually. So I'll probably let me sort of prioritize some of the things that are particularly important, but there are zillions of things. I'm sure I'm probably not going to mention everything now, and somebody will be sat listening saying, well, she didn't mention this, but I'll just prioritize on some of the things. I I think understanding learners' interests is a key part of that. I'm starting with the learner now. So understanding what they're interested in. We talked a little bit before about giving them voice. So finding ways to connect to their interests. For example, this notion of passion projects, allowing learners to work on things they're passionate about, that they're excited about. Having questions and discussion space where they can talk about things that they're interested in. So allowing them to bring in who they are outside of the English classroom, their interests in other spaces, being able to use that and draw on that if you can in the classroom is a great benefit for boosting engagement, because not all our learners are interested in English. And that's okay. And
I agree.
Well, and, that's just how it is. That's life. Not everyone's going to think English is so great and they want to learn it and they want to, But finding what they do, what they are interested in, and how they can bring that into the English classroom. Sometimes helping them to think explicitly about what they can do with English and why English might be useful for them. So the relevance, the utility value, if you like, of English. So also exploring very explicitly how we can make English as a language to study more interesting for them, where they can find a personal connection, something of relevance to them. So that whole notion of interest, looking at their personal hobbies and interests, but also looking at how we can make English as a subject interesting, relevance and value and maybe utility and so on. I think that's part of it. I think in psychological terms, another big part of it is understanding whether a learner feels that they can do it, how competent they feel. And that's a big sort of part of, if you don't feel that you can learn an English, you're not very good at English and English is not your thing, you might not even try to engage because you don't think there's any point. So that takes us back to this psychology, the two aspects of that psychology, back to the notion of mindsets. So for those who are not familiar, I'll just explain. Mindsets are the beliefs that we have about learning abilities. So do we believe that language learning ability is something that is fixed, that is given, that is inherent, you're born with it? Or do you believe it's an ability that you can develop through practice and training and strategies and opportunities and so on? And they're called fixed and growth mindset. So fixed mindset, you believe that you've been sort of given this talent as a language or you haven't been given it. And growth mindset is my abilities as a language learner is something I can develop. Now, it doesn't say everybody's going to reach the same level. That's unrealistic. But the notion of a growth mindset is that the idea you can improve. But it doesn't say that you're going to. It doesn't say what level you'll achieve. Some people will always find it more easy than others. But it just means fundamentally, I believe I can change my abilities. They're not fixed, they're not set in stone, but it's something I can do. Now, this belief for me, I believe it's very important. It's not straightforward black and white as it's presented, fixed mag. It's not that straightforward. I think people are more complex than that.
Certainly, yeah. So you just reminded me of something I've read. It was it goes like this. Does motivation lead to achievement, or achievement leads to motivation?
It's a good question. I think it's both. I think it's both. I think it goes both ways. I think you can look at it as a reinforcing circle, if you like, that if you are motivated, you're going to make that extra effort, you'll go that extra mile, you'll be willing to do extra work, you'll be able to do all the activities, you're going to be interested, you'll engage fully. So I think you've got that. All of that we know contributes to achievement. If you are successful, that can give you a boost. That can give you a sense of, I can do this. I've been successful once. I have a sense of control over that. And then you can start that cycle again. Now, the interesting thing is if you were successful, but you blame that success on luck. You just said, for example, I was really successful in that exam, but it's not about my ability. I was just lucky. It might not affect your motivation and might not lead you to invest because it's not something you can control. You've just attributed it to sheer luck. Exactly. So assuming that you say it's up to me that I was successful, it's down to what I did, it's down to the effort I made, it's down to the strategies I used, then of course that would start that positive cycle of motivation and achievement helping each other.
Okay, one of the most asked questions by language educators is that how can I have my students engaged? How can I engage them in my activities? From what you mentioned, you said we have to pick the tasks, for example. We have to change them somehow to meet their interest, right? What if the material that we have, maybe we have general topics that don't have any relation with the student's interest. In this case, what should we do as language educators? Yeah.
Okay, so let's have a little look at how we can go about that. So there are sort of two things. So first of all, we'll perhaps come back to that later. I think you need to have the right conditions in the class to create the kind of mood that the students want to learn. So you can have the most motivating, engaging task on the planet. If you haven't got a good relationship in that classroom, it's doomed to failure. So I think you need to make sure that learners feel safe, that they're willing to speak up, that they're not afraid of getting things wrong, that they've got a good relationship with the teacher and their peers. All of that makes it easier for tasks to be successful. Now, for tasks, to make tasks engaging, you can, if we go back to this choice and voice, it's about giving learners a sense of control. So helping learners to feel they can. So even if you've got a course book and you have to follow it page by page, let's say you've got a course book where you've got 2 reading activities. You can say to the learners, which one shall we do first? Should we do this one or this one? What do you find more interesting? Which would you like to start with? Now, that's not changing anything apart from just giving them that tiny little bit of a feeling that they can have some choice in what's going on. Then
they have some voice.
They've got some voice. Then let's say, for example, you've got 10 gap fill activities. You can say to learners, you know what? I don't want you to do all 10 of those gap fill. Just pick the 6 that you're most interested in responding to. And the 4 that you don't want to do, you can leave them. If you want to do them all, you can do them all. But otherwise, just pick your favourite 6 of those activities to do. So it's all about building in these little ways in which we can give the learner a sense of control over their learning, a sense that they have some decision, they have some voice, that they can do things. Even if you have, I don't know, I'm trying to think of some of the topics in the course books. They're all sort of, it's all strange topics. There's very, very usually some way you can make that personal. So I don't know what would be a good topic. What's a topic? What's a topic you've covered recently?
Let's say urbanization.
Urbanization. Okay, then you've got a simple question saying, would you rather live in the city or would you rather live in the country? Why? If you had to go and live in whatever the opposite to what they say is, how do you think you would adapt to that? What could you do with that? If you should design your ideal lifestyle, what would it look like? If you're looking at, any question that can make them, if you were going to write to your local politician, what things do you think need to be changed about your local town? Go out and interview people in your local community. Go and find 5 people to talk to in your community and report back to us. What did they say they loved most about where they live? And what did they like least about where they live, for example? So there are ways of getting the learner active, getting them involved, giving them a chance to personalize things, bring in their own opinions, have some choice, make decisions. So they don't have to be, like you say, throw out your entire materials and start again. For most teachers, that's utterly unrealistic. It's just about how you look at what materials you've got and think, how can I tweak this? How can I work with this in a way that's going to empower my learners a little bit more, that gives them a little bit more control of what happens, that brings in their voice a little bit more, that gets them active, and that takes us maybe a little bit beyond what's on the paper.
Great. So this goes into voice, okay, and material. Now I just wrote a list of what you've said. Okay, so we have positive relationship.
Yes.
Yes. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, of course. So I think for me, it has always been my belief that the relationship you build with the learners as a teacher and among the learners is crucial to successful teaching, not just in terms of engagement, but in terms of everything. So the relationship between teacher and learner needs to be one of respect, going both ways. And I tend to think if you respect the learners, the respect from them will come. You have to earn respect. Respect is something you get given, or shouldn't be something you get given just because you're the teacher. It's something that you should earn by modeling the kinds of behaviors that earn you some respect from the learners. So there's all sorts of things like, knowing your learners' names, being interested in what they do, having what we call micro conversations, which are, when you just see them at the door, say, hi, how was your day? I saw your football team did very well at the weekend. I'm pleased to hear that. Little bits of these conversations can be really important. I think learners need to feel seen. They need to feel that somebody knows who they are and knows that they're in the class and knows things about them. And these are big things. There's a great expression I've forgotten. I think it's called Kerpen, who says, "Be interested, not interesting." So, interested in the learners. Ask them questions about themselves, ask them about their lives, and build up that relationship. And there's also the notion of self-disclosure. So self-disclosure doesn't mean that you tell your learners all about your life because they're not interested in all your life, but just little things where you maybe share what you did at the weekend or your favorite film, or your favorite TV show. Just that little bit of appropriate self-disclosure is also an act of trust. So when I tell you something about myself personally, I'm trusting you with that information. And if teachers can do that in an appropriate way and share little bits with their learners, the learners, they recognize that and they're willing to give back. Because, we expect learners to talk about their hobbies and what they did at the weekend and their plans for their holidays and what they would like to do. And so giving back a little bit of ourselves is a way of building up that kind of trust and that relationship with learners. Then the other set of relationships are the ones that we foster among the learners. And that obviously is a more tricky thing
It's more challenging,
It is indeed, yeah. So group dynamics have always been a mystery to me. And even though I've spent literally my whole career looking at psychology, trying to understand relationships, trying to understand how people tick and work, sometimes I have a class and I just can't put my finger on why it works or it doesn't work. I don't know what it is about the group or who it is or the combination of people. So group dynamics is one of the trickiest things, I think, as a teacher. But I think there are some things that we know that do work well, and that's a complete zero tolerance of any kind of mockery or laughing or anybody feeling embarrassed or being bullied. That's a complete no-no. A sense that you welcome mistakes as well, that you don't jump on every mistake, but that that you do create that culture of mistakes are welcome here. We see it as part of the learning process, that it's not always about correction. That we as teachers try to be sensitive and thoughtful about how and when we give feedback so that we don't embarrass learners or we don't make them feel uncomfortable, and that we think about doing it in discrete ways, and that we think about doing group feedback instead of focusing on individuals, that we don't interrupt them, all those kinds of things. So they need to feel safe in the group. They need to feel safe among the learners and being able to speak up. Allowing learners to mix in the group. So sometimes learners know who they want to work with, and particularly at the beginning of a course, it's good to allow learners to work together. They feel a bit safer with someone that they know. They can do partner work together and so on. But it is nice, if it's possible in your setting, to sometimes mix learners up so they work with a different partner occasionally. And you can tell them that's why. You can say, you are always talking to your friend. Maybe if you talk to somebody else, you might hear something different for a change. So I'm just going to mix you up a little bit, just so that you can talk about something fresh with somebody new, and then you can report back to each other on what you found out when you talk to somebody else. And that's quite important, because it gets learners to talk with other people and they get to see them as real people and not just as other people in the class who are kind of anonymous, but they get to know them individually. And that can help, lower anxiety.
Yeah, so this leads us to safety. Okay, so we as language educators, we should create a safe space for language learners to learn. Right?
Yes.
And I also, in one of your talks, I heard you saying that when I took my MA, I became a better teacher. I became more sensitive.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So should we be sensitive with our students, and how?
So I think what I mean by the use of the word sensitive is, I wonder if sensitive is the right word, in fact, or if I mean aware. So aware of them as individuals, aware of what's going on in the classroom, more sensitive, to body language. So being able to read the mood of the room, noticing is a big word. So noticing when a learner is being excluded or is not taking part in a group, and then looking at how learners talk or look at each other and interact. So that reading the room, the more experience you have, the easier that becomes, I think, as a teacher. But it is something that you can become a little bit more conscious of and a little bit more sensitive to and aware of in thinking about what's happening in the class and how I suppose it's a big part of this is also empathy, thinking about how your learners might feel, how they might have responded, how they might take a comment that sometimes learners interpret what you said in a way that you didn't intend. And sometimes it's afterwards you think, I hope they took that the right way. And then sometimes I've even gone back to, by the way, I meant it like this. Did you take it like that? I didn't mean it. And I say, yes, fine, or whatever. So. Yeah, I think it's that empathy that you try to build and develop. Because I think empathy is a skill that you can train and you can develop and you can get better at. And sometimes we're better at it and sometimes we're not so good at it. And, as teachers, we're also human. We also make mistakes and sometimes we get it wrong. But
of course.
We come back and we do our best to imagine how our learners are feeling and imagine how they might respond or interpret things that you say or things that happen in class. That kind of maybe sensitivity as a teacher.
Yeah. Okay, can we now just talk about motivation?
Okay.
Usually we as teachers, as language educators, when we see students not engaged, we say, oh, well, they're not motivated to learn. So this is a wrong assumption, right?
It could be.
Yeah, because they can be motivated, but not engaged.
That's right.
So we as teachers, we should change for example, we should incorporate more voice of students, build a strong relationship with students, create a safe space for them, teaching methodologies, the tasks.
Yeah, so it's actually very astute. I love the way that you worded that. I think that was one of the reasons Alton and I got into doing engagement, is that when I was working with teachers and we would talk about motivation, sometimes they'd say, but I can't motivate my learners. And there is this expression, you can take a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. And I watched a wonderful talk, and we quote it in the book, and I can't remember off the top of my head. It was a wonderful teacher from Vietnam at Tesol one year, and she said, but you can make the horse thirsty.
Interesting.
Isn't that lovely? And I thought that was great, is that, you can't force anyone to learn. You can't force anyone to be motivated. But what we can do as educators is we can create those conditions hopefully that maximize the likelihood they will engage. There is never a guarantee because learners are individual, they have their own agenda, they have their own lives outside the classroom, and that may be what's holding them back, and it may have nothing to do with your teaching. But what we can do as educators is we can control what happens in the classroom. And that's why engagement is so appealing to educators, because it puts that more in our control. Whereas motivation is harder to influence, engagement is more something that we can control. So I think you're right. I think there's the things about looking at interest, looking at learner interest, looking at the relationships, getting them to feel safe, getting them to feel that learning is something they can do. But then the next step is, how do you design tasks that are engaging? So we talked about choice and voice. You can bring those in.
Yes.
But then also there needs to be a sort of certain amount of challenge. So it needs to be something that learners get curious about. Something where they find that's interesting, something where they want to know more. So, for example, the thing that people often do when they have a reading activity is they use prediction. So they maybe show a picture and say, what do you think this is about? What do you think this story's about? How do you think this story's going to go? How do you think maybe the story's going to end? So you get them curious, you get them to predict. And then when they read, they've got another purpose for reading. They're going to find out if they were right or not in their predictions. So curiosity, creating that curiosity, getting them interested, having them ask questions about things, posing them questions. Those are great ways to trigger that curiosity about things. Again, putting them in an active role. So often in education, very often learners have to be passive. They have to listen. They have to do. Language learning should be a kind of hands-on activity where possible, getting them to do things, getting them to take control. So the kinds of approaches that are known to be very engaging are things like problem-based learning, project-based learning, inquiry-based learning. So where they have something that they can explore, that they can look at in more detail, that they can go off and research, they can investigate, maybe they can work with others collaboratively. Those kinds of very active kinds of learning approaches tend to be ones that are known to be particularly engaging.
Yeah. So while achieving the tasks, Okay, so we have a very active class, they have an active role. We as educators, we should we should work with them and be, we shouldn't guide them, but we should give like constructive feedback.
Sure.
Right.
I mean, these kinds of roles that see the teacher as facilitator doesn't mean the teacher has no role. It means they have a very important role, but it's one that is not actually so straightforward. So the traditional role where the teacher is at the front, fount of all knowledge, and doing a transmission model of teaching, that's relatively easy in that nothing is challenging for the teacher. They can predict what's going to happen because they're in control of everything. They just stand there and they do what they have to do. And then if the learner learns, they learn. And if they don't, they don't.
So we should be facilitators, yeah.
So we should be facilitators, but in the role of a facilitator, you've got to read the room. You've got to read your learners. You've got to go around and answer unexpected questions. You've got to be open to learners asking you unexpected questions and taking the class in a way that you didn't expect it to go and so on. So I think it's quite a challenge to be a facilitator because it takes teachers sometimes out of their comfort zone. It also means that you have to be responsive. It's more varied. It's less easy to predict, less easy to control. Yeah. Now, for me, those are all reasons why it's more fun.
Yeah.
That's why I enjoyed it. I enjoy teaching them when I've got no idea what's going to happen and they do things that I weren't expecting them to do and they behave in ways that I hadn't thought they were going to do and they come up with ideas. Sometimes their ideas for activity are better than mine. And then, I present an activity and then one of them says, well, I wasn't going to do it like this. I was going to do it like this. And I go, oh, actually your idea is better than mine. Okay, let's do it like that. Let's try that. So
should we praise them?
Right. So praise is a real tricky one, isn't it? So I tend to say we should always encourage them because that's less controversial. So encouragement is never wrong.
Okay.
Praise is tricky when it comes to mindsets. If you praise them for the process of learning and for specifics in the task, that's fine because they can learn from that. If we praise them for the product, it puts an emphasis on output rather than process of learning.
Yeah.
And if we praise the person, if I say, Lucia, you did a fantastic job of this, you were really great at vocabulary, it gives her this sort of sense it's a talent, as opposed to, Lucia, I loved how you got all the plurals right with the Y. You changed it to IES every time. I'm really pleased to see how you did a good job with those plurals that you wrote down. So when you're very specific like that, it's something that other people listening can learn from too, because it empowers them. So it's not like, oh, she got praise for being good at vocabulary. I didn't get that praise. Maybe I'm not so good. So you have to imagine that the learners don't just hear their feedback, they hear everybody else's too.
Yes.
They interpret that in relation to themselves. So I think if you can focus on the process and you can focus on very specific things, then praise is, of course, wonderful. And everybody, no matter how old you are, everybody needs praise. But if you wanted to play it safe in terms of a notion, I think everybody needs encouragement.
So we should be careful. We should be careful because some damage can happen with other students.
I think, first of all, you have to think about the effect on other students, but also we don't want to inadvertently create this fixed mindset. In other words, we don't want learners to start thinking, oh, it's something you're either good at or you're not. So if I say, Lucia, you're very good at vocabulary, it might create the idea in her and in others that vocabulary is something you're either good at or you're not. As opposed to if I focus on the strategy, I loved how you converted all the adjectives into adverbs. You did that beautifully. You got them all right. You managed to match them up and collocate them correctly. That kind of feedback is focusing on something very specific that anybody can learn and take control of. So you're not making it about the person, but you're making it about the process or a very specific part of learning.
Okay, because sometimes I see teachers, they don't want to discourage students. So what they do is they always say, for example, if the student comes and asks, for example, Mr., is this good? Well, for me, for example, I say, it's good, but you always enter with but, then you pinpoint the mistakes, the errors, the things that you want to be changed in the essay or the presentation or whatever. So you always start with a positive feedback, then you pinpoint. You always have a but at the end.
So I probably avoid pitting things as good and bad. I pit it all as giving advice. So one of the things that we all do as teachers, myself included, is we tend to focus on what is wrong and what has to be improved. And that's, I call that the teacher disease. I think we all suffer from it. So we all tend to sort of focus on what's wrong and what needs to be made better. And one way that we can approach feedback is, rather than seeing feedback as this is good and this is bad, we can say to the learners, I'm going to give you some advice based on what you've done. Now, look at this, how brilliantly you did this. Now, very specific things. I think you need to remember to do that in the future. And maybe you could teach, for example, Ali about that, because Ali's been struggling with that. And I think Ali would really benefit from learning from you about that. So very specific, positive feedback. Because learners are not daft. And if we say to them, oh, this was good, but I'm now going to tell you all the things that were wrong, the learners, that good didn't mean anything. There's nothing good about what I did. And they just focus, we all tend to focus on the negative. So I think we could give it in terms of advice, very concrete advice. What went well? Why was it good? How can we use it again? And also, these are the things, I've got some ideas of how we might do that better next time. So let me give you some advice. My advice would be, you need to look up this, you need to work with this. I think you could benefit from looking at this, you could work on this. So rather than telling learners what is good and bad, I can say, let's draw out advice from this. What advice can we take from this for next time? And that notion of advice means that all advice is good, and it's not packaged as good and bad. It's packaged as ways to make your writing better in the future. And that can apply to things that need improving, but also learning very specifically from the things that went well, because sometimes we go blind to those things. We don't notice those. And it can be really nice if we can say to them specifically, this was great what you did. I loved how you worked on this. I loved how you structured this. Look at the way you use signaling words here. That's fantastic. Make sure we think about that. Look at the next time you do a piece of writing, check also, have you done such a great job with your signaling words? That kind of feedback is, I think, encouraging. It's praise, but it's very focused and very specific, and you can transfer it to a new learning context and think about it again in the future.
I agree.
So that learners also know, what did I do well? What specific, how can I use them again?
So now, in order to engage students in the classroom, we have to pay attention to incorporating students' voice in material selection and teaching methodologies. We should build a strong, positive, healthy relationship with the students. We should break the ice from day one. Also, they should feel safe in the classroom. They shouldn't be mocked. Everyone should have the right to speak. No one should make fun of each other. No one should humiliate each other. And also, they should have a choice.
Yeah, I think having a choice is nice. I think if you can give them choice, and even if it's just between two tasks, we can do A or B, or you can choose who to work with. Or even if you say, guys, this is the activity that we're going to do today. How long do you think you're going to need? Shall I give you 10 minutes or 15 minutes? What do you think? That kind of, they're just such small things, really, but they're a sign and a signal to your learners that you want to incorporate them, you want to give them a sense of control, you want them to be active in their own learning. And so it doesn't always have to be big, massive changes, but just looking when you've got activities, is there somewhere I can get the learners to make a decision here? Is there somewhere? Not every time. Sometimes I have to say, guys, you need to do this. I'm going to give you exactly 10 minutes to do it. Please give me a handshake or a wave, or just call me over when you're done, and then we'll move on to the next thing. Sometimes you have to be. And I think that's the skill of a teacher, is knowing when to use what. And sometimes you vary it. But certainly if we can find some ways to bring in learners, and sometimes let's say you, exactly like you described, you've had a whole lesson where it's been quite sort of centered, learners have been active, but maybe it's been quite a teacher-directed session. You can still at the end say, okay, guys, I'm going to get you to do some exit tickets. Just write down what you loved from today, what you didn't like from today, and what you've still got questions about from today. Just write it anonymously, quickly on a piece of paper, and just pop it on the desk when you walk out the classroom. Now, that doesn't need any prep. You don't need to prepare anything. You can just do that very quickly at the end. And it's still a way that, even though the whole lesson was teacher-centered, you're still asking for their opinion at the end. You're still having a look. And for you, it's great feedback. You learn from what your learners do. And if they tell you what questions they still have, you can see what maybe they didn't learn, or what they've not got a hang on yet, what they need a little bit more time with, maybe.
This is a brilliant idea, Yeah, I'm going to use that.
You have to let me know how it goes.
So, Dr. Sarah Mercer, I have learned a lot from you. So before we conclude our interview, do you have any final thoughts or recommendations for teachers who are striving to enhance learner engagement in the classroom?
I do, and I'm going to say something controversial and probably not what you expect, although given what we talked about earlier, maybe you might expect it. I'm going to tell them to look after themselves first. If there are teachers listening to this, they are probably extremely dedicated teachers who are working hard, taking their job seriously and very focused on how they can help their learners. Everything you've asked and your whole manner tells me that you're one of those dedicated teachers who thinks about their learners and thinks about their learners' well-being and thinks about how to help their learners. Particularly those kind of educators can sometimes lose sight of what they need and their own well-being and their own needs. And I think to be the best teacher we can possibly be, we also have to start with ourselves and look at what we need and what our well-being, and make sure we have enough break and enough rest, because then we can go with that extra energy and the willingness to try out ideas and the willingness to explore things, the willingness to engage with learners as co-constructors of what happens in the classroom. That's easier to do, all of that, when we feel we've got the energy and the inner strength to do that. And so I think my last piece of advice is maybe start with you as well. And it's okay, it's not being selfish to say, I need to look after myself in order to be in the best place, to be the best kind of teacher I can possibly be. And that isn't selfish, it's just the foundation of good practice and giving myself the opportunity to have the space to be the kind of teacher I would like to be.
Brilliant. Yeah, I agree with you. Sometimes we forget our own well-being. We just want to focus on this, on that, how to engage my students, how to create my material. Okay, this lesson is boring. How can I make it more interesting? And I spend hours and hours and hours of preparation, and I neglect myself as well. So yeah, I agree with you. Dr. Sarah Mercer, thank you very much. I have learned a lot. I'm sure that our audience will learn from your interview. It was my pleasure to have you in our first podcast.
I'm very honored. Very honored to be the first.
Yeah, the first episode with you. Yes, so it's such an honor and such a pleasure to have you. Thank you so much for your time.
And thank you so much for inviting me. It's been lovely talking to you, and I hope in some way it was useful. And thank you very, very much.
Thank you. Hopefully in the future.
I'm sure.
Thank you so much.